Well, good morning, everybody. I hope you guys got good rest and enjoyed your breakfast. Up on the roof is always a nice place to be. It's good to see you guys this morning, and it's a pleasure to welcome George Harbison for our first speaker of today. George Harbison is a retired chief financial officer, and in his role as a financial executive, Mr. Harbison attained a deep knowledge of federal and state tax matters. And actually, during his tenure as a chief financial officer, he managed buy and sell side transactions totaling over $1 billion. And he utilized this knowledge to analyze, dissect, and refute popularly held but fallacious tax assertions. In 2013, Mr. Harbison wrote a piece for Forbes.com in which he completely debunked Warren Buffett's famous and politically charged assertion that his federal tax rate was well below the rate paid by his office workers. Since then, his tax myth-busting articles have appeared in Forbes.com, RealClearMarkets.com, RealClearPolitics.com, and AmericanThinker.com. And it's also in a book called Excuse Me, Professor, which I believe you guys will be receiving today. And if you don't, it's only about a 4-page article that is super clear and helpful. I would recommend just navigating to that. George, is it number 47?
Not that I memorized it, but it's 44.
44. So he wrote that article that's in Excuse Me, Professor, Challenging the Myths of Progressivism, co-edited by Foundation for Economic Education and Young America's Foundation. He has also appeared twice as a guest on The Larry Elder Show. In 2016, at the request of a YAF student leader, Mr. Harbison created and delivered the presentation that you will see today, titled The Victims of Socialism at the University of California in Riverside, California. This presentation was subsequently delivered at over a dozen college campuses, and Mr. Harbison's lectures on this topic have been co-sponsored by YAF and the Victims of Communism Memorial Foundation. Mr. Harbison has also presented the Victims of Socialism at several YAF student conferences at the Reagan Ranch Center in Santa Barbara, California, one of which was just a few weeks ago. So it's going to be good to hear this multiple times. And Mr. Harbison has received a BA from Kenyon College, where he majored in physics. He continued his education at the University of Michigan, where he received an MBA with an emphasis in finance and accounting. Mr. Harbison resides in a beautiful home on the Mullet Lake in Michigan. He previously served as the on-field announcer for the Miracle League of Orange County, California, a baseball league for special needs children. George is a great friend to Young America's Foundation and Foundation for Economic Education. So welcome, George Harbison.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathaniel, and thank you also to YAF and FEE for inviting me to participate in this great event. So we'll just get started. It is customary for speakers to inject a bit of levity at the beginning of their lectures in order to connect with their audiences. However, this approach is not appropriate this morning, as there is absolutely nothing humorous about the topic I'm going to speak to you about. As such, I'll forego any attempt at humor and will jump right into the presentation. The rise of socialism as a perceived viable ideology in the United States over the past several years should be of grave concern to all Americans. Sadly, it is not. While many conservatives have warned of the dire consequences of socialism, they have not done a good job of conveying the sordid history upon which their fear of socialism is informed. This incontrovertible history will be the focus of this lecture. Before diving into this history, I'm going to spend the first few minutes describing what socialism is, and just as importantly, what it is not. Then I'll tell you the horrific and tragic story of the victims of socialism. The last part of the lecture will deal with socialism within today's political landscape. It is a timely topic. This quote will help get the discussion started. I know that some people in the United States associate the Nordic model with some sort of socialism. Therefore, I would like to make one thing clear. Denmark is far from a socialist planned economy. Denmark is a market economy. So just whose words are these? Rush Limbaugh? Donald Trump? Ben Shapiro? No, these words were delivered by Lars Rasmussen, the Prime Minister of Denmark, speaking at Harvard University just a few years ago. Prime Minister Rasmussen is indeed correct. Denmark is not a socialist country, nor are the rest of the Scandinavian countries, as the following table demonstrates. The Index of Economic Freedom has been published annually by the Heritage Foundation for 27 years. The 2021 version of this index has just been released. The index is a composite score based on 12 measures of economic freedom, covering 178 countries. The higher the score, the higher the level of economic freedom within that country. The United States is ranked 20th in the 2021 index, 11 slots below Canada and 13 slots below the United Kingdom. Scandinavian countries, in light blue, despite being welfare states, all rank quite high in the index, from 10th to 28th in the rankings. The average Scandinavian score of 75.4 is above the United States score of 74.8, with 3 of the 5 Scandinavian countries having a score higher than that of the United States. Socialist country scores, in red, are all well below the United States and Scandinavian scores, reflecting their much lower levels of economic freedom. This index and Prime Minister Rasmussen's quote show that Scandinavian countries are not remotely close to being socialist countries, despite what Bernie Sanders wants you to believe. So if Scandinavian countries and their welfare states are not adherents of socialism, then just what is socialism? In Marxist theory, socialism is a transitional phase between the overthrow of capitalism, which is freedom, and the realization of communism, which is a class-free, state-free utopia. Socialism, as the ideological agent of this transition, relies on a totalitarian, authoritative state to actualize forced economic equality, the elimination of private property, total state control of the means of production, the de-emphasis of the family unit, and the abolishment of religion. The terms socialism and communism are often used interchangeably. Early in the 20th century, Marxist ideologues began their crusade to impose communism on the world. To do so, they took over countries and imposed the meat grinder ideology of socialism on them to forcibly wring out class differences in their quest for the utopian ideal of communism. This brutal, totalitarian campaign resulted in the deaths of millions of people. These are the victims of socialism, and now I'm going to tell you their tragic story. To begin, I'm going to read excerpts from an article titled, "Can There Be an After Socialism?" written in 2003 by Alan Charles Kors, professor of history at the University of Pennsylvania. Kors wrote, "No cause ever in the history of all mankind has produced more cold-blooded tyrants, more slaughtered innocents, and more orphans than socialism with power. It surpassed exponentially all other systems of production in turning out the dead. The bodies are all around us, and here is the problem. No one talks about them. No one honors them. No one does penance for them. No one has committed suicide for having been an apologist for those who did this to them. No one pays for them. No one is hunted down to account for them. It is exactly what Solzhenitsyn foresaw in the Gulag archipelago. No, no one would have to answer. No one would be looked into." Continuing with Kors, "To be moral beings, we must acknowledge these awful things appropriately and bear witness to the responsibilities of these most murderous times. Until socialism, like Nazism or fascism, confronted by the death camps and the slaughter of innocents, is confronted with its lived reality, the greatest atrocities of all recorded human life, we will not live after socialism." Again from Kors, "It will not happen. The pathology of Western intellectuals has committed them to an adversarial relationship with the culture, free markets, and individual rights that has produced the greatest alleviation of suffering, the greatest liberation from want, ignorance, and superstition, and the greatest increase of bounty and opportunity in the history of all human life. This pathology allows Western intellectuals to step around the Everest of bodies of the victims of communism without a tear, a scruple, a regret, an act of contrition, or a reevaluation of self, soul, and mind. Today, we are going to tear the veneer off of the intellectual self-serving pathology and shine a bright light on the reality of the terror, death, and destruction inflicted on the world by the perpetrators of this hideous ideology. Again from Coors in his brilliant essay, "We are surrounded by slain innocents, and the scale is wholly new. This is not the thousands killed during the Inquisition. It is not the thousands of American lynching. This is not the 6 million dead from Nazi extermination. The best scholarship yields numbers that the mind must try to comprehend. Scores and scores and scores and scores of millions of bodies." The pictures you will see today are disturbing. Horrific as they may be, they are accurate images of the agonizing pain, suffering, and death inflicted upon these innocent victims of socialism. Sadly, there were literally thousands of pictures to pick from in compiling this presentation. Beyond the visceral horror conveyed in this small sample of imagery, this presentation will attempt to put into perspective the sheer, staggering number of deaths caused by socialism. Churchill said, "Socialism is the philosophy of failure, the creed of ignorance, and the gospel of envy. Its inherent virtue is the equal sharing of misery." Churchill was right. Soviet socialism, based on the collectivist philosophies espoused by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, took hold in Russia after the October Revolution in 1917. Led by Vladimir Lenin, a vicious and ruthless ideologue, the victorious Bolsheviks set forth to fundamentally change Russia based on Marx's utopian vision of society. Lenin and his fellow socialists nationalized industries and confiscated private land and other property from its owners. Religion was officially eliminated from the Russian society as Russians were forced at gunpoint to worship the power of the state. In order to firmly establish his new ideology, Lenin resorted to a campaign of mass murder of his political opponents in a purge now referred to as the Red Terror. It is estimated that upward of 1.5 million people were murdered in this brutal campaign. Lenin personally sent the orders to introduce terror and kill those who resisted the socialist takeover of Russia. This telegram is an example. "Comrades, the Kulak uprising in your 5 districts must be crushed without pity. You must make example of these people. 1. Hang publicly, so that people see it, at least 100 kulaks, rich bastards, and known bloodsuckers. 2. Publish their names. 3. Seize all of their grain. 4. Single out the hostages per my instruction in yesterday's telegram. Do all this so that for miles around people see it all, understand it, tremble, and tell themselves that we are killing the bloodthirsty kulaks and that we will continue to do so. Yours, Lenin." As vicious as Lenin was, his successor as Secretary General, Joseph Stalin, was even worse. In 1929, Stalin ordered the forced removal of minor landowners and better-off peasants, the kulaks, from their farms, while simultaneously ordering the collectivization of Soviet agriculture. Under dekulakization, millions of kulaks were executed or shipped off to re-education camps in the Arctic. Under collectivization, Stalin's socialist government confiscated all private farms and livestock. Surviving peasants were forced to work on collective farms under strict government control. These 2 brutal measures resulted in millions of deaths, particularly among the deported kulaks. Soviet collectivization and dekulakization efforts were met with great resistance in Ukraine, a vast area populated by 40 million people, situated between Moscow and the Black Sea. As a result of this resistance, the Ukrainian people became the target of Stalin's wrath. In 1932, Stalin imposed impossibly high grain quotas on Ukrainian collective farms and ordered the removal of every handful of food from the region. Secret police were ordered to arrest any peasant caught stealing even the smallest amount of food. Military blockades were erected to prevent food from entering the area and to prevent the hungry Ukrainians from leaving. Predictably, and as was intended by Stalin, these measures led to a horrific famine. Entire villages were wiped out, and in some regions the death rate exceeded 1/3. The Ukrainian countryside, home to some of the most fertile land on earth, was reduced to a silent wasteland. Somewhere between 5 and 10 million Ukrainians starved to death in a famine now referred to as the Holodomor. From 1936 to 1938, in an attempt to consolidate and strengthen his power, Stalin conducted the Great Purge, also called the Great Terror. Unlike the previous socialist mass murders carried out in the countryside, the Great Purge was primarily directed at Communist Party members, government officials, and Red Army leadership. In this reign of terror, hundreds of thousands of victims were accused of various political crimes, including espionage, sabotage, anti-Soviet agitation, and conspiracies to conduct coups. Those accused were either summarily executed by shooting or sent to the labor camps. According to declassified Soviet archives, during 1937 and 1938 alone, the Soviet secret police detained over 1.5 million people, of whom almost 700,000 were shot. Western scholars estimate that the actual number murdered was nearly twice this number. Stalin also presided over the vast expansion of the Soviet Gulag system, the infamous forced labor and re-education camps run by the socialist regime. The Gulag had a total inmate population of about 100,000 in the late 1920s, when it underwent an enormous expansion coinciding with Stalin's collectivization of agriculture. By 1936, the Gulag held roughly 5 million prisoners, a number that was probably equaled or exceeded every subsequent year until Stalin died in 1953. Political prisoners consisted of rich or resistant peasants arrested during collectivization, purged Communist Party members and military officers, suspected saboteurs and traitors, and dissident intellectuals. Prisoners entered the Gulag in 3 major waves. In 1929 to 32, the years of the collectivization of Soviet agriculture, in 1936 to 38, at the height of Stalin's Great Purge, and in the years immediately following World War II. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, perhaps the Gulag's most famous inmate, claimed that between 1928 and 1953, some 40 to 50 million people served long sentences in the archipelago. Figures supposedly compiled by the Gulag administration itself, released by Soviet historians in 1989, revealed that a total of 10 million people were sent to the camps from 1934 to 1947. Gulag prisoners lived under the threat of starvation or execution if they refused to work. It is estimated that as a result of long working hours, harsh climatic and working conditions, inadequate food, and summary executions, at least 10% of the Gulag's total prisoner population died each year. Given the gory mathematics, Western scholars have estimated that the number of deaths attributed to the Gulag runs well into the millions. Solzhenitsyn wrote, "Socialism of any type leads to a total destruction of the human spirit and to a leveling of mankind into death." The Black Book of Communism, the authoritative reference source for the deadly statistics of communism, conservatively estimates that Soviet socialism led to the deaths of 20 million human beings. To put this in perspective, 20 million is roughly the entire current population of the state of New York. The magnitude of horror, death, and destruction brought about by Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin as they ruthlessly imposed socialism upon Russia and the Soviet Union is beyond human comprehension. As bad as the Russian people suffered under these two monsters, the Chinese people's descent into the hell of socialism was far worse. Mao Zedong was the greatest mass murderer of the 20th century. In 1949, as chairman of the Communist Party of China, Mao proclaimed the foundation of the People's Republic of China. He then set forth to impose his version of Marxism on the Chinese people. The results were catastrophic. Mao employed a familiar playbook in imposing socialism in China. The Great Leap Forward, launched by Mao in 1957, brought with it the forced collectivization of China's agricultural sector in an attempt to accelerate the growth of the country's industrial sector. Not surprisingly, the expropriation of private farms, and with it the elimination of economic incentives to produce food, led to famine and mass starvation. It is estimated that deaths from hunger alone reached more than 50% in some Chinese villages, and ultimately 30 million to 40 million Chinese peasants perished, roughly the entire current population of California. In 1968, the year before the United States first put a man on the moon, a young Chinese Red Guard who was being pursued in the countryside by the authorities took refuge in a village in Anhui, where he heard many stories about the Great Leap Forward. He later wrote, "We walked along beside the village. The rays of the sun shone on the jade-green weeds that had sprung up between the earth walls, accentuating the contrast with the rice fields all around and adding to the desolation of the landscape. Before my eyes, among the weeds, rose up one of the scenes I had been told about, one of the banquets in which the families swapped children in order to eat them. I could see the worried faces of the families as they chewed the flesh of other people's children. The children who were chasing butterflies in a nearby field seemed to be the reincarnation of the children devoured by their parents. I felt sorry for the children, but not as sorry as I felt for their parents. What had made them swallow that human flesh amidst the tears of grief of other parents, flesh that they would never have imagined tasting, even in their worst nightmares? In that moment, I understood what a butcher he had been, the man whose like humanity has not seen in several centuries, in China not in several thousand years, Mao Zedong. In the mid-1960s, Mao came to the conclusion that current Chinese socialist leadership was moving too far in a revisionist, less ideologically pure direction. In response, in August 1966, Mao launched the Cultural Revolution. Schools were shut down, and Mao called for a massive youth movement to act against Communist Party leaders for their embrace of bourgeois values and lack of revolutionary zeal. Soon, the student paramilitary groups called the Red Guards were formed, and they attacked and harassed members of China's elderly and intellectual population. How ironic it is that the intellectual class was the target of Mao's bloodthirsty student brigades. Professors had their faces smeared with ink, were forced to get down on all fours and bark like dogs. Many were beaten to death, and some were eaten after being murdered. Mao, the so-called great helmsman, reveled in the bloodletting, boasting, "What's so unusual about Emperor Shi Huang of the China dynasty? He had buried alive 460 scholars only, but we have buried alive 46,000 scholars. No microaggressor was he. Roughly 1.5 million souls were exterminated during the Cultural Revolution." Mao also established the Logai, a vast system of forced labor and re-education camps. Over 1,000 camps were established, and it is estimated that roughly 50 million people passed through these camps through the mid-1980s, with upwards of 80% of these being political prisoners. It is estimated that 20 million captives died while being imprisoned in this Chinese version of the Gulag. The Black Book of Communism estimates that Chinese socialism led to the deaths of 65 million people. That's the equivalent of the combined population of California and Texas, our nation's two most populous states. Think about that. Everyone living in Los Angeles, San Francisco, San Diego, Houston, Dallas, plus so many, many more, dead. Perhaps no other country suffered more at the hands of its socialist masters than Cambodia. Pol Pot's murderous Khmer Rouge seized control of Cambodia in 1975, and they then set about to impose socialism on the Cambodian people. The country suffered horribly under the socialist brutal oppression until Pol Pot was ousted in 1979. Highly xenophobic, Pol Pot set about to completely isolate the country from outside influences and to establish a collectivist, radically agrarian society. To accomplish this, the regime closed all of the country's schools, hospitals, banks, and factories. Religion was outlawed and all private property confiscated. Most citizens in urban areas were forcibly relocated from their homes to work in the collective farms. The Khmer Rouge told these residents they would be moved only a short distance from home and that they would return after only a few days. People who refused to evacuate were killed on the spot, and their homes burned to the ground. The evacuees were instead sent on long marches to the collectives, during which tens of thousands of children, the elderly, and the sick died. Inevitably, the elimination of private economic incentives to grow food, coupled with economic corruption and inefficiency, led to a horrific famine. Although deaths from starvation were widespread, acts such as picking wild fruit or berries were seen as private enterprise by the Khmer Rouge and were punishable by death. Commercial fishing was banned, resulting in a loss of a primary food source for millions of Cambodians, 80% of whom relied on fish as their only source of animal protein. To make way for Pol Pot's vision of an agrarian utopia, money was abolished, books were burned, and most of the country's teachers, merchants, and intellectual elite were murdered, as they were viewed as potential enemies of the state. One need only be seen wearing eyeglasses to be branded as an intellectual and shot. Of course, in congruence with standard socialist protocol, all religion was banned. Anyone seen taking part in religious activities or services was summarily executed. Thousands of Buddhists, Muslims, and Christians were murdered simply for exercising their religious beliefs. Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge brigades took power in Cambodia in order to create an agrarian communist utopia. Inevitably and tragically, the experiment ended just like every other experiment in socialism: a dreadful, deadly disaster. The Black Book of Communism estimates that Cambodian socialism led to the deaths of 2 million people, or roughly 25% of the country's population. That's roughly the entire current population of Chicago, Illinois. Today, we have seen vivid images of the horror, destruction, and death inflicted in the 20th century by these three socialist regimes. Sadly, many more experiments with this grotesque ideology dot the historical timeline of the 20th century, each, without fail, resulting in the same hideous result. We have been presented with numerical comparisons set forth to highlight the sheer magnitude of the number of people killed by these regimes. By any measure or comparison, the toll is absolutely staggering. To deny this, or to invoke the argument of capitalism's moral equivalence to socialism, is to engage in abject intellectual dishonesty. But there is one additional facet of this human tragedy that cannot go unmentioned, one that is infinitely more difficult to see or to quantify. This being the realization and recognition of the personal fear, horror, agony, and pain experienced by each of the millions of human souls vaporized by this ghastly ideology in the 20th century. Real, blinking human eyeballs once filled the empty eye sockets of the dried-out skulls, now stacked like cordwood, of the victims of the Khmer Rouge. These eyes belong to real people, human souls with special talents, loves, dreams, and aspirations. They belong to mothers, fathers, sisters, and brothers, sons and daughters, human beings just like all of us gathered here today. Just imagine the horror and sadness witnessed from these eyes. Just imagine the tears shed from them over a beloved child dying from starvation in his mother's arms. A friend being shot simply because she wore eyeglasses. An infant slammed to death against a tree in front of his agonized parents. And for what? To sustain an ideology that runs completely counter to human nature. an ideology that totally extinguishes human freedom and dignity and replaces it with forced allegiance to a totalitarian, all-powerful state, an ideology that, in the name of radical egalitarianism, brutally crushes any semblance of individual initiative or creativity, an ideology that must build walls to keep those subjected to it from fleeing, an ideology whose adherents believe that the end justifies the means, no matter how horrible both of these are. Make no mistake about it, the millions of deaths caused by these three socialist regimes were no accident, nor were they an unfortunate or unintended consequence of forced seismic changes in political and economic systems. Communism's goal of achieving a utopian society with absolute and forced equality for all is at such odds with human nature that it requires the imposition of brutal and total control by the state over every aspect of the lives of those subjected to it. Those who resisted, those who desired self-reliance, and those who dared to seek freedom had to be liquidated. How do we know this? How can we be so certain? Because the architects of this evil ideology told us exactly what they intended to do. Lenin said, "Surely you do not imagine that we shall be victorious without applying the most cruel revolutionary terror?" Stalin said, "The death of one man is a tragedy. The death of millions is a statistic." Mao said, "We are prepared to sacrifice 300 million Chinese for the victory of the world revolution." Pol Pot said, "He who protests is an enemy. He who opposes is a corpse." Fortunately, there were leaders in the West who recognized the moral rot underpinning socialism and who fought back. President Ronald Reagan, Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, and Pope John Paul II each understood the monstrous nature of socialism. In one of the greatest triumphs of the 20th century, they worked together in the 1980s to undermine and defeat the Soviet Union's evil empire without firing a shot. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall ceased being a barrier between communist East Berlin and free West Berlin. In 1991, the Soviet Union dissolved and socialism in Eastern Europe collapsed. The free world rejoiced as nearly 1 billion people were freed from the shackles imposed by this repugnant ideology. Sadly, roughly 1.5 billion people in the world still live under oppressive socialist regimes in China, North Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cuba, and now, happening before our eyes, in Venezuela. One need not bother waiting for the tenured professors of Marxist studies teaching in America's colleges and universities to lecture about the fundamental, inherent evils of socialism. Such critical thinking will not be forthcoming. As Professor Coors noted, their pathology allows them to step around the Everest of bodies of the victims of communism without a tear, a scruple, a regret, an act of contrition, or of your evaluation of self, soul, and mind. Rather, the true story of socialism is understood and told best by other victims not mentioned so far today. For you see, not all the victims of socialism perished in the killing fields of Cambodia. Not all are buried beneath the Siberian tundra, dragged lifeless there from a hellish gulag. Not all lie in mass graves dotting the Chinese countryside and in Eastern Europe. The other victims of socialism are those who survived this wicked system, those who risked their lives and the lives of their loved ones to escape from their socialist oppressors. Escapees from Cuba, boat people from Southeast Asia, former residents of Soviet-dominated Eastern Europe, 5 million refugees fleeing Venezuela's ghastly experiment in socialism. People who have actually experienced and utterly rejected the horrific, soul-crushing ideology of radical egalitarianism. Listen to them. Listen to their personal stories of socialist oppression. Take in the far-off looks in their eyes as they speak of the loved ones lost or left behind during their desperate and dangerous flights to freedom. Listen to their profound gratitude for and appreciation of the freedoms that most Americans take entirely for granted. Listen to these survivors, for only they can truly speak for the 94 million human souls sacrificed on the bloody, godless altar of socialism in the 20th century. To the young people in attendance, the events of the 20th century chronicled in this presentation may seem to be ancient history and too far removed, both chronologically and ideologically, to be relevant in today's America. Don't be lulled into this complacency. Socialism is alive and well. Its destructive force has recently been unleashed on a previously prosperous nation located only about 1,500 miles southeast of Miami. In the 1990s, young Venezuelans may have felt complacent about the prospect of socialism impacting their country, but they then personally witnessed the rise of Hugo Chavez and his brand of socialism, the implementation of which led to Venezuela experiencing the biggest economic collapse in human history outside of war or state collapse. Since 2013, Venezuela's GDP has declined by 50%, a decline double that suffered by the United States during the Great Depression. As a result, over 5 million Venezuelans voted with their feet and fled the country, a number representing almost 18% of the total population. Venezuela's path to socialism serves as a stark example of what could happen in America. Unlike Russia, China, and Cambodia, any transition of the United States to socialism will likely not come as the result of sudden, violent overthrow of our government. Rather, socialism will prevail here when a complacent and oblivious electorate gradually elects socialist politicians who will shred the bedrock constitutional provisions currently in place to protect our freedoms. This process has been going on here for years, aided and abetted by an educational system steeped in socialist ideology. As a result, for example, we see the promulgation of a history curriculum in our schools based on the 1619 Project, written by socialist sympathizer Nicole Hannah-Jones, which makes the absurd claim, among others, that the American colonists fought the Revolutionary War in order to preserve slavery. We see preening woke executives directing millions of dollars of contributions to Marxist-inspired Black Lives Matter, ignorant of the revolutionary and violent nature of this organization. We see the pushing of the Green New Deal, a vast expansion of government control at the cost of individual freedoms, fueled by hyperbolic climate claims. We see governments too quick to implement unconstitutional and authoritarian directives in response to the COVID pandemic, with no concern for the negative impact of these directives on commercial enterprise, foregone medical care, addiction, and community mental health. So what can you, as students, do to push back against the progressive indoctrination you are subjected to in your schools? When your professor tells you that the United States is a racist, oppressive nation, ask him to explain why it is then that the caravans of migrants from Central America always make the long trek north to racist, oppressive America, instead of making the relatively short march southeast to socialist, utopian Venezuela. When you hear a student claim that capitalism breeds unhealthy levels of economic inequality, mention that this freedom-fueled inequality is a far more righteous outcome than the lethal equality suffered by almost 100 million people under socialism in the 20th century. And while those atrocities were taking place, capitalist countries were achieving the greatest standard of living in the history of the world. When a professor tells you that socialism is simply fire departments, post offices, and libraries, ask her how it is then that the implementation of these things could have possibly led to the deaths of almost 100 million people in the 20th century. When you hear someone extolling the virtues of Cuba's healthcare system, remind them that no one in history has tried to sit on an inner tube and float from Key West to Havana, while hundreds have perished attempting to float in the opposite direction to freedom. When a classmate tells you that the rich don't pay their fair share of taxes, point out to them that the top 3% of taxpayers in the United States pay over 50% of the nation's income tax bill, and that the United States has one of the most progressive tax systems in the world. When you are told that socialism is a great idea in theory, respond that no, socialism is a terrible idea in theory, a horrible concept made much, much worse when actually implemented. Above all, remember this as you enter the fray. As a conservative, you are on the right side of history and on the moral side of righteousness, and that the facts will always bear this out. Ronald Reagan warned against the authoritarian forces intent on subverting American freedoms when he addressed the Phoenix Chamber of Commerce in March 1961, where he said this: "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. Or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free." Reagan's words were as accurate today as they were 50 years ago, as the storm clouds of socialism and its inherent authoritarianism currently gather over our great country. In his famous speech in support of Barry Goldwater's 1964 presidential candidacy, Reagan said this: "We'll preserve for our children this, the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness." Ladies and gentlemen, we must stand full square against the socialist forces that are intent on eroding the freedoms we have enjoyed for almost 250 years. To fail in this quest will indeed sentence our exceptional country to the same darkness that befell those enslaved by their socialist masters over the course of the past 100 years. Before taking questions, I'd like to ask that we observe a moment of silence in memory of the millions of victims of socialism, past and present. At this time, I'd be delighted to respond to any questions you may have.
All right, we'll open it up to questions. Raise your hand if you have any questions for George, and I'll bring the mic over.
Can you state your name and what school you're from?
I'm Sarah. I'm from Buchanan High School. My question for you is, does the statistic of 94 million include the deaths from the Nazis?
No, that's a great question. It does not. And I think the allusion there is the fact that the Nazis were socialists as well. And you may know that the term Nazi is a contraction of the term National Socialists. So it's a great question. I don't believe the 94 includes that.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Madeline Salvato, and I'm from Options for Youth. My question is, on social media, you often see things like free healthcare and free college. How would that negatively affect America and lead to socialism?
Yeah, and free healthcare and the like, that's not socialism, to be clear. It's more like what does happen in some of the other countries in Scandinavia. But even though I would not deem that to be a definition of socialism, it's kind of a direction there. But what it does is it just disincentivizes people to work and to provide for themselves and their families. If things are provided for them free of cost, it takes away the incentive for them to work, to save, to create businesses, and to, again, move themselves forward. So in that regard, on an aggregate basis, it would not be helpful. Those kinds of things are not helpful to the country.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Ezra Smolgard, and I go to San Ynez High School. And I'm wondering, what are some more signs that show that a country is leading into socialism or communism?
Yeah, you know, some of the speaker yesterday, Pete and Z, mentioned the kind of the slow process that's gone on in this country for many years. And so we see things like the pandemic. I mentioned it in the presentation. Well, what was one of the things that was done in the pandemic with regard to evictions? Anyone know? Yeah. Yeah. So there was an eviction moratorium, which is it was ruled unconstitutional, thankfully, very quickly after several months. but that was simply a taking of property. That was landlords having their property effectively taken away from them. And wasn't that one of the things we talked about? Is one of the core tenets of socialism is the elimination of private property. So as you start to see things where there's a diminution of the family unit, and we all know many instances of that, things like the COVID and the things that the school, what's going on in your schools, and parents who fight back are being labeled as domestic terrorists. That's the kind of rhetoric that has been exhibited in the past, and it's another indicator of a direction that we could head if we're not careful.
Thank you.
Any other questions for George?
All right, that's it. Thank you
All
for
right,
being such
yeah.
a great audience. Thank you very much.